And welcome to Around the Ozark Spotlight. Each week, we uncover the stories behind the people who live and work in Southwest Missouri, those individuals with entrepreneurial spirit who work to better the lives of others, or put pen to paper to write books about the stories and history of the Ozarks and its people. I'm your host, Scott Meier. Today, we're going to explore the world of Judaism here in Southwest Missouri with Temple Israel Rabbi Sam Radwine. Hey, Sam.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. Now, nobody knows who Sam Radwine is except for your synagogue here locally. So, if you wouldn't mind, Sam, let's take a step back and why don't you introduce yourself? You've got quite a varied history.
Indeed, I do. In a way, coming to Springfield, Missouri is like coming home. I actually grew up in the Jewish community of Springfield, Illinois, and up in a little town about 30 miles away from there where there were very few Jewish families. So living in a place where we are almost invisible is really very natural. And I spent most of my career in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area. So
Mhm.
this coming to Temple Israel represents quite a change.
Now, not unlike many of us that are either reaching or have retired, we haven't retired. I continue to work. I see that it wasn't long ago that you actually retired and then you found your way back to Fayetteville and then all of a sudden became a rabbi for a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, it was Bentonville. I was
Or
in
Bettendorf. Okay.
retired. I retired from the full-time pulpit in California in 2013,
Mhm.
and my husband and I found our way back to Northwest Arkansas, where he grew up in Rogers. We joined, and then I became the leader of Congregation Eitz Chaim in Bentonville. And unfortunately, they had to cease operations because of the nature of the community and people moving in and out of Walmart and Walmart affiliated businesses.
Mhm.
Uh, there was nobody there. And it's a very sad thing to close the synagogue. But evidently they knew that when they founded it, wasn't even 20 years before. So it just wasn't viable. And
Well, it's interesting you say that, Rabbi. We've had a chance. My wife and I and family have had a chance to live around the country, and we spent about 7 years in the Northeast, just outside New York City. I worked in the city, but when you come to an area like we moved here about 8 years ago, when you come to an area like Southwest Missouri, finding someone of the Jewish faith, you got to work pretty hard at it.
there are not a lot of us here. And we have to stick together. But I have to say this, that I have found the Temple Israel community to be a very close group and a warm group, and people who are interested in reaching out to our greater community. And
Hmm.
it's been in my short time here, it's really been a joy to be part of that.
My guest today on Around the Ozark Spotlight is the Rabbi Sam Radwine, and Sam is the rabbi at Temple Israel in Rogersville, which many of you of our listening audience may or may not even be aware of. How large a group is that?
We
And do we
have
call them? We don't call them congregants, right? Synagogue is
we call them members in
okay.
the American synagogue model. You generally take membership of a synagogue, which means you are considered part of that group. Um, I believe that they are someplace between 70 and 80 member households right now.
Okay.
Um, that's a lower number than it has been in past years, but that's what they are now. And the good news is that they are very viable and very active, and they're very lay driven. I am there really on a part-time basis, and they do a lot of work to keep their congregation viable.
Sam, now we go back into your history. You're an alum of, you're an Illini, right? You went to the University of
Oh,
Illinois,
yes. Yes.
but you majored in music. Now I know your history, and again, some of this will be in education. So if you don't mind taking some time to explain what these things are, you majored in music, but then you found your way to New York and actually became a cantor.
Yes. Um, After getting an undergraduate degree in instrumental music education, in other words, I was a band geek. Um, I taught public school for 6 years and decided to go to seminary to become a cantor. A cantor is the person in Jewish clergy
Hmm.
that becomes sort of like a minister of music, perhaps in a Protestant church. we're responsible for a number of things, not the least of which is the musical part of our liturgy, but larger is really we spend a lot of time training our children to celebrate their bar or bat mitzvah. We
Hmm.
work with choirs, both adult and youth choirs, and we do all the pastoral work that rabbis do anyway, visiting the sick, officiating at life cycle events, weddings, funerals, and all that. So that's really what I spent the bulk of my career doing, was as a cantor. And very late in life, I decided to study for my rabbinical ordination, which I did.
Well, that's quite a undertaking. You were kind of slowing down, and all of us. I mean, to step in the shoes of a rabbi, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is, and it's very different, and I don't think it's anything what I expected it to be. Um, I think when I went to study for the rabbinate, I thought I was just getting the credentials for what I already knew how to do, and boy, was I mistaken. It's a very different kind of interaction with our congregants, and it can be intense, it can be painful, but at the end of the day, it's very rewarding because if you can do something for somebody who has your need and is in a difficult place,
Hmm.
uh, I found an incredible amount of meaning in that. So I feel that I'm grateful to come to the place that I did.
Sure. As a rabbi, can you paint a picture for our audience on the differences between Judaism and Christianity?
Sure. Um, that's always question number one. So thank you for jumping right to it. Um,
No
you
problem.
know, people say, "Well, you guys don't believe in Jesus, do you?" I said, well, "That's kind of a harsh statement." I like to say that Jesus Christ is not part of our narrative. We have a
Hmm.
narrative that goes back thousands of years, the central core of which is our Bible, which we call the Tanakh, and which Christians would call the Old Testament. Old
Hmm.
Testament is a Christian term. We call it our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And of course, the narrative of Jesus is not part of that. So that's really the largest point of departure. And adherence to the commandments as our tradition understands them, and as they were enumerated in the first 5 books, which is called the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses in general parlance. That is the center that drives what we do as Jews, how we observe our lives, what we do, what we don't do, and how we seek a relationship with God.
Having lived in the Detroit area when my kids were growing up, we spent a lot of time. We lived in a fairly heavy Jewish group of individuals where we lived on the west side. And my kids went to school with and interacted with a lot of Jewish kids, so they were involved in mitzvahs, whether bar and bat, and many of them. They can do the Baruch Atah about as well as any non-Christian, I think, at this point. But let's talk about a mitzvah. That's another one of those words or terms that maybe some have heard of but don't really understand. Can you explain what a mitzvah is?
Sure. So the word, it comes from the root meaning commandment or obligation. In Judaism, we understand that the Torah outlines 613 different places where God says, "I want you to do this," or "I don't want you to do this."
Hmm.
Those are the mitzvot, 613 mitzvot. Now, that might be confusing for folks because they think, well, aren't the commandments just the 10 commandments that you find in Exodus and Deuteronomy?
Sure.
In Jewish tradition, the 10 Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 things that we're talking about here, we don't call them commandments. They're really referred to as the 10 utterances. And it's, even though it's the basis for Jewish belief and Jewish practice, it's not the totality. And the
Hmm.
totality of those 613 places where God says, "I want you to do this," "I don't want you to do this." But it comes from the word commandment. I actually like the translation obligations, the things that we are obliged to do by our identity.
And they can be quite elaborate. I've been to mitzvahs that have been held at temple, which are coffee clutches and some cake and ice cream and that sort of thing. And I've been to mitzvahs that are off the charts, quite frankly. Is that pretty much carried forward by family, or is there expectations there, or did it
So
just kind of burgeon onto itself?
let me just make a clarification of what you're talking about is a celebration. The celebration is
Yes.
called either a bar mitzvah
Ah,
or a bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah for a boy, bat mitzvah. It's a celebration of one entering the age of majority when one becomes 13. And
okay.
that's a celebration of them taking on the obligation of the mitzvah. So the celebrations that you're referring to can be varied. The culture that I grew up in, we had a lovely service at temple on Friday night.
Mhm.
And then on Saturday, we had people over to the house and with deli platters. And we played records on our old record player. I mean, that was 1965, okay?
Sure.
Today, depending on the community, some of the celebrations are elaborate
Hmm.
and with a lot of flair.
Yeah.
But I really believe that people are looking more towards the mitzvah than the bar, if you will. In other words, celebrating the obligation. Many synagogues, including the synagogue that I serve now, or that I do serve, students are obligated to perform a mitzvah project. In other words, something that they take on that somehow affects their community, their world, that they perform some kind of an obligation, which then is celebrated by the celebration, but is really the center of the celebration, which is them taking on the responsibilities of an adult Jew.
Absolutely. My guest today on Around the Ozark Spotlight is the Rabbi Sam Radwine. And Sam was explaining that it wasn't always Radwine. When your family found its way, and I think you mentioned that your family's originally from Russia. Is that correct?
Correct.
When they found their way to the United States, do you think the Radwine was changed, like for many people that were coming into the country when they were coming either through Ellis Island or some other points of entry?
So all four of my grandparents came from what was then called the Russian Empire. Today, more specifically, it's the region that we call Belarus. My father's parents came in around 1910. And I actually found a copy of the ship manifest.
That's pretty exciting.
It was very exciting. It's amazing what the internet coughs up for you these days. And on the ship manifest, the name was written down Rotvin. So it was probably how they heard my grandfather say it. Now, my grandfather was not terribly literate, and someplace along the way, somebody must have written down Radwine, and that's how it stayed. Now it's not fixed. So happens that my father's brother dropped the E, and he became Radwine.
Okay.
So now we felt that was an easier name to carry at the time. But the authenticity of surnames is not that old, and it really only goes back to a couple centuries. On my mother's side, I went back, was able to go back to my great-grandfather, who did not take a surname until he was forced to by the government. He was known as Baruch ben Binyamin, Baruch the son of Benjamin. And that's how Jewish names were until the host culture required us to take a surname.
Now, as you start speaking, was that Yiddish? What was his name in
No, that
Yiddish?
was actually Hebrew. That's actually Hebrew.
That is Hebrew. Okay.
Hebrew names. And all Jews have a Hebrew name. And you're known as so-and-so, the son or daughter of so-and-so. And that's your identity. It's a surname is really not part of that. But we're given the names when we're born. They're used ritually from the time of our bar bat mitzvah. They're used at a wedding when we sign a wedding contract, and then they're used at the end of our life when a memorial prayer is recited in our name.
Okay. There's so much history. There's so many places we can go here after the break. We're about to break, and I want to thank my guest for holding in there, Sam Radwine, and we'll be back in just a moment with more on Around the Ozark Spotlight. I'm your host, Scott Meier.
Hey, everybody, it's Ethan and Sarah Forhetz from your favorite podcast, Around the Ozarks in 5. I'm sure you've been wondering, how can I get even more amazing stories, events, and witty banter to start my day?
Well, look no further. Here we are. Sign up for our daily newsletter. You'll have what's going on around the Ozarks right at your fingertips each weekday morning.
Yeah, just go to aroundtheozarks.com, click on the newsletter tab to sign up.
Thanks for listening to Around the Ozarks in 5. We hope to see you in your inbox soon.
Welcome back to the second half of today's Around the Ozarks Spotlight. I'm your host, Scott Meier. With me, I'm excited to have a guest that I've heard a lot about, haven't had a chance to meet, but I have friends that attend services at Temple Israel in Rogersville, and we have the Rabbi Sam Radwine, who is a traveling rabbi. Where else do you travel to?
Well, I actually live in Rogers, Arkansas, so I come to Temple Israel one weekend a month, but I also lead services on Zoom, as with many congregations.
Oh, is that right? Okay, so
Yes.
you are basically Temple Israel's rabbi, whether you're a fixture here or you're a digital
Yes.
fixture.
Exactly. And it so happens that I'm also the dean of the Cantorial School of the Academy for Jewish Religion, California, which is a Jewish seminary based in Los Angeles.
Sure.
But we are our instruction is all online. It's what we call a hybrid program. So I spend a large part of my week teaching and administering that program too. So I travel virtually.
Okay. Well, these days that the pandemic had a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
There's many different levels, not levels, but there's different studies within the Jewish faith, from Hasidic Jews to very contemporary Jews or liberal Jewish members. Where do you fall? And can you explain a little bit about each of the different types of study?
Sure. I think I like to use the word denomination.
Okay.
It so happens the Temple Israel is affiliated with the Reform Jewish movement, which is the largest Jewish movement in America. And it was basically a movement that, though it has its roots in 19th century Germany, was basically founded and flourished in America.
Okay.
The different denominations, I don't like to define them in terms of more or less, but it really has to do with how we understand our relationship to our tradition, our relationship to God, what God expects us to do. Central to Jewish tradition is something called halakha, which means Jewish law.
Mm-hmm.
And those are there and are contained the obligations that we have to do. If one understands Jewish law as being ordained by God and being only movable through the interpretation of the rabbi, then one basically is orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
The Reform movement was founded with the understanding that we have different ways of reading Scripture. And Scripture might be divinely ordained or it might be divinely inspired, that God has something to do with it. And therefore questions somehow the idea of the strict obligation of the Scripture. And sometimes things need to be looked at within the context of the world that we live today. Just to look back at the roots of that, in 19th century Germany, Jews were for the first time interacting with the culture at large. That seems like a no-brainer, but up until that time, Jews basically lived a sequestered life, not always by our own choice. And for the first time, Jews found themselves living with non-Jewish neighbors, doing work with non-Jewish neighbors, dining with non-Jewish neighbors. And sometimes the strictures of Jewish law made that problematic. That gave rise to Reform Judaism. In America, you had people who still felt a strong connection to the tradition, but yet felt that there still needed to be some adjustments. That became the root of the conservative movement of Judaism. The conservative movement of Judaism has a legal structure, but it also allows, for instance, we now live in a world of egalitarianism where we understand religious obligations to be the same for men and women, which conversely gave rise to women leaders, women rabbis and women cantors. And that became Hasidic Judaism is a sort of a different flavor of orthodoxy, which goes back to much earlier in Eastern Europe. It gets a little bit more complicated, but leave it to understand that there is a there's a spectrum of observance of Jewish law, particularly in America, and some of it is visible to the general public, and some of it isn't.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Sahidic. Isn't there a
Hasidic?
Hasidic?
Yeah, there's Hasidic Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Hasidic Judaism is it originated in Eastern Europe, and it understood this. It was sort of an anti-intellectual movement, actually. That rather that Judaism would flourish not necessarily through strict study of the traditional texts, but by the ecstatic worship of God. I think what I find interesting is that you can see a comparison somehow in the spectrum of the worship of Christianity, where you have some people who there are certain forms of worship that are more ecstatic and more boundless in energy, if you will. And I think that's the nature of the way that the Hasidic movement evolved, and it evolved into certain communities that still exist in America today. Probably the most prominent is the community called Chabad. Chabad is a network of congregations and yeshivot, of houses of study, that are descended from the Hasidic movement, but they have also done a lot of work in outreach to Jews. In other words, their mission is really to help Jews remain Jewish or more Jewish, if you will.
Sure. It's complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. That's, if I learned anything, it's that there's a lot there. Now, you mentioned the other day you're also a Zionist. Can you explain that?
Contemporary Judaism understands that there is a need for the homeland for the Jewish people. This was a movement that was started in the late 19th, early 20th century. The name Theodor Herzl was an Austrian Jewish journalist who first wrote that he felt that we needed our own homeland, and thus evolved the return to the modern state of Israel, where there was always a Jewish presence throughout the years. In other words, this was not late. But the idea to make it for it to become an actual state, an actual country, that movement began in the early 20th century, culminated by the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. I strongly advocate and I strongly support that. That's not to say that the modern state of Israel is fraught with problems. And without going further into it, some of the conflict is really what we're reading in the daily news today. That's problematic. But at the end of the day, given all those conflicts, I still very strongly advocate that Israel should be a homeland for all Jews who want to live there.
Well, without getting too deep in the weeds, because I know we agreed not to do that, but Israel just really went through its own version of 9/11, only about 10 times worse when you do the math on the population. As an American Jew, any thoughts?
I'll speak for myself, but I think I speak for a lot of people, not only in our community, throughout America. Quite frankly, we're in a period of shock and grief. Most of us have not experienced this kind of trauma. I remember the trauma, obviously, of 9/11, but this is new. And 1,400 Jews were murdered in one day, which was the most since the Holocaust.
Sure.
So even though we are a faith that believes in the sanctity of all lives, not just Jewish lives, all lives, I'm not a military strategist, nor do I pretend to be one. But I do believe, as was expressed by our president, that Israel has the right to defend itself. And the current climate is difficult, it's painful, it's sad, it's scary. A lot of Jews are scared right now and afraid of the backlash. Let us remember, though, as you stated at the beginning, this began with the murder of 1,400 Jews. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. there was a ceasefire. There was no
Mhm.
there was no combat. Combat
Mhm.
began by Hamas on October 7th.
It's tough, and I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. It's got to be difficult to see and or hear some of the anti-Semitic conversation going on in this country right now. I guess openly, what it at least does is it's open, as opposed to maybe something that's pushed behind or pushed into the darkness sometimes. But I'm amazed at um, some of the things being said, and this whole thing about from the river to the seas, and I mean, we haven't heard this kind of rhetoric in what, 70 years.
I'm going to tell you a story. This is one of my old man stories. It happened to me when I was 14 years old, and was in junior high school at the time. And the principal, who I had a nice relationship with, some kind of a, I don't know what was going on at school, but somehow he came up to me and says, "I got this great joke for you. I want you to tell your dad."
God, yeah.
And it was a joke with an anti-Semitic punchline. And I kind of didn't know how to react, and I said, "Okay," and I walked away. I went home and I walked in the house and I burst into tears. And I didn't get it. I said, how could this nice man, who's the principal and leader of children, and how could he have said something so mean and hateful? And my mother, who also grew up in a small town, she grew up in Decatur, Illinois,
Hmm.
she said, understand that it's always there. Whether they say it or whether they don't, it's always under the surface. Now, she grew up in a different time.
Hmm.
She grew up in a time when it was probably less politically correct, or incorrect to make anti-Semitic comments, and there was a time that
Sure.
they too. But I always had a feeling, I always had that knowledge that it was always there under the surface. And that's a horrible feeling, to think that the people that you live around, you may not be able to trust.
Hmm.
Sadly, that's what we're seeing right now. I will tell you that I have seen anti-Semitic comments from other religious leaders, people who I respect and people whose social values I share.
Hmm.
And that's very sad, very painful, and very scary, quite frankly.
Do you think, as an educator, that there's enough education these days, not necessarily 10 or 20 years ago, but these days, that talk about and or revisit the history of and the importance of the history of the Holocaust?
There's education for people whose minds are open to hearing about it. Unfortunately, I find that the dialogue that we hear today, or the monologue, if you will,
Hmm.
the narrative in the news, is people who have not sought to open their minds to education. They have a preconceived notion, who get their news from who knows where, and take that as a given. There was a wonderful event that took place. Unfortunately, it ended around the time of the pandemic. Took place in the city of Springdale, Arkansas, and it was an annual Holocaust education event. And it was founded by one woman, an older woman who was Protestant. She grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, actually in Chicago, and she felt that people didn't know the history of the Holocaust. And so scholars were brought in, and classes were done, both for young people and for adults. And it was pretty amazing that this thing happened in Springdale, Arkansas.
Hmm.
So hopefully maybe there were some people who sat through that and understood what that was about. The majority of the people today, it's not where they get their news. It's not where they get their education. So is there enough? No, and then never probably will be. And I'm not even sure how the people are reached.
Let's hope there's more ladies like the one in Springdale, Arkansas. We got about 25 seconds left. Rabbi, would you like to share any kind of a prayer?
We say a prayer that at the end of every service we say, "May the one who makes wholeness in the heights send wholeness to us, to the people of Israel, and to all peoples everywhere." And then we put the Amen, which means we believe that.
I want to thank my guest today, Rabbi Sam Radwine, for joining me and speaking from the heart. I appreciate that, Rabbi. Also, my producers, Taylor Worley and Jay Stevens, as well as all of you for joining us. If you happen to miss all or part of today's program, you can always find it in its entirety on MidwestFamilySpringfield.com website, the AroundTheOzarks.com site, or our new app for ATO, which can be found in the Apple apps or Android apps. You can hear today's show as well as all the others from the last year on that site. I'm Scott Meier, and remember, every day is a gift. Have a great day.